Hi, Cory. Thank you for joining me
Hello.
today.
Hey, nice to meet you. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for coming. Why don't you start us off by telling us a little bit about yourself and what you do?
I've grown up in Ohio, Northeast Ohio. I wasn't sure what I want to do when I went to school. I ended up studying engineering briefly. And although I've always really wanted to go into filmmaking, but I didn't know any filmmakers. So I think that was just a little bit of a process trying to come around to acceptance of that. After I went to school for design, and then afterwards I have done a number of careers, really. I think if most people who know me now, they kind of define me as someone who just does a lot of different things, maybe a filmmaker first and foremost, but then just all kinds of areas of design and almost every aspect of like the filmmaking process I've been involved in and kind of participated in one way or another. And I've done a number of I like getting involved with community stuff as well, which is partially why I've probably stayed in Ohio instead of maybe kind of going out to one of the coasts. So yeah, filmmaker, designer, and many, many different things. So.
Wonderful. When you say community stuff, what do you refer to?
I've done a mix of stuff. I mean, my mother was a high school teacher. My sister's in education. My dad was youth minister. So I think that was sort of a normal part of kind of our world growing up. So I've done everything from helping to develop a theater program with an after-school program at North Hill in Akron, which is it's like kind of a immigrant heavy kind of area of Akron. I've been involved with nonprofit theater. I've helped open kind of a non-for-profit coffee shop music venue in Cuyahoga Falls. And I've been like a camp counselor my whole life, ever since I was 18. And I just love doing stuff around the community. I love a nice thriving arts community, and I don't know, I just grew up with it and I still love it. So just a bunch of different ways.
Wow, well, that's fantastic. And it sounds like you're the person to go to if we want to know what's going on in the community, stuff to go do and help out with and participate in. So definitely gonna take note of that. So what interested you in filmmaking in the first place? You said that you were always interested and then you were a bit down because you didn't know any filmmakers. What initially sparked that interest as a child?
I mean, as a family, we definitely watched a lot of movies, which I know is nothing too particularly unusual, but that was just a big part of it. I remember I have a lot of very strong memories of films as a child. I remember the first time I saw a movie at the University of Akron. My dad took me. I was very young. I think we saw Aliens, which my wife still thinks it's crazy that my dad took me when I was so young, but it was just such a blast. It was a very lively crowd. I'd never seen, film with like all college students. And I loved the story and just the crowd and the energy. And I remember anytime on television, if there was like making a featurette of a film, which was hard to find back, like in the 80s, with the advent of like DVDs, it was really easy to come and buy that stuff. But I just was so fascinated by the process of filmmaking. And I was in, like children's plays. My mom did a lot of stuff with our church, like tons of like performances. So just costuming and learning lines and stuff like that. And I think I just had like a big love of the arts, a big love of science, and film just seemed to be something that encompassed all of that. So I always wanted to do it, but yeah, just not knowing anyone who did it, it seemed a bit of a pipe dream, but I never discounted it. I just didn't really know how to approach it.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, which is one reason why we have this channel to begin with and why I'm interviewing people is to spread that information so that maybe somebody who might be interested in pursuing an area in the industry that you have pursued might have some kind of in. So I met you on the set of the Tri-C film Air, and you were there, I believe, just walking around that day, right? Watching what we were doing, because you are going to be doing the special effects for that film, correct?
I was like consulting on that and helping out with that. Miriam Benning, who kind of started up in many ways the film program at Tri-C. She asked me if I wanted to start teaching there. I've been teaching at Kent State, so I've been teaching there probably close to 8 or 9 years. So she asked me to stop by, and it was right by the theater and some other places that I'm very familiar with in Akron. And so she asked me to come down, and because I have a history in special, like visual effects and animation, I've kind of specialized that in many ways in my career. And then teaching at Tri-C, I've definitely kind of taken a role of helping out with students with doing a lot of visual effects work. And I mean, it's a little more specialized, that area, not as many people know that. So I try to kind of help out with that as much as I can. So I was more kind of consulting and kind of just being on set and giving some advice as far as how to help that out. And I just like watching filming anyway. So
yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Who doesn't love being on set, right?
Right. Yeah.
So when you're teaching, then are you primarily teaching visual effects, and that's shortened to VFX?
Yeah, I wouldn't say I'm sure some people, especially if you're working like in the industry, like out in LA, this probably can be a little more specific. Is it what's special effects versus digital effects versus practical effects? And yeah, VFX, I use that sort of broadly. Practical effects always involve something physical. Okay. And CGI, computer generated imagery, always involves something digital. VFX, I'd use that as just sort of like an all-encompassing kind of acronym for that. Although most of what I do tends to be more digital, but there's always a connection between like physically what's being made and the digital realm. I think there's not really as much of a separation as that, as a lot of people I think maybe would think that there is. It's always kind of an interplay between what they're doing on set and then how it's relating to the digital world. And a well-functioning visual effects kind of situation would generally involve a lot of communication between physical production and post-production.
Okay, so I'm hoping that you can elucidate this smoke and mirrors for me. Like, I, as somebody who has literally no idea about anything digital, hardly at all. I mean, I can barely build my website. I'm just curious, when someone approaches you about a project, like, hey, I want to include some digital stuff, some special effects. What is the process from like proposal process, or like proposal to creation to, I guess I just want to know, what would a film, if I were to come to you, this is, okay, let's just get to the meat of it. If I were to come to you for a project that I'm working on and say, Cory, I want to include some special effects, or I think that this would enhance my film, what do we do? I'm wondering what you would tell me or ask me.
Yeah, well, normally I don't really, because I work primarily as like an independent kind of artist and designer, and I don't live in Los Angeles, I don't tend to work there. I don't really assume when I meet people and they need something for a project that they're necessarily going to have a really kind of clear and comprehensive idea of what it's going to take to get that. So I can normally go in just wanting to hear what people want as the end results. I don't really need them or kind of expect them to have an idea of exactly how that would be done. I consider that kind of more my responsibility. Okay. So as I hear it from them, I'll kind of hear what they want, and then we'll sort of, maybe on just kind of a very high level, talk about some of the different techniques that could be used to sort of achieve what they want in that. And then I'll kind of explain, just like time, cost, et cetera, of what it takes to do that, to achieve that. And then after like a kind of an explanation of some of the processes and potential, and, then we'll kind of see, like, is it achievable? And because lots of times people may think, it's not at all unusual that people will think something that would be really complicated or difficult really isn't as hard as they would think, or vice versa, that they want to do something in their mind, it seems very simple, but it actually would be quite a lengthy process to pull it off.
Like what are some examples? And I wanted to ask as well, like, what are common things that people ask for, and what are common things that are digital that maybe watching we don't actually know, as the viewer who has no idea, are actually digital?
Yeah. I mean, today I would tell people, like, if you're watching something that's produced with a budget that's like in the millions, which doesn't mean it has to be some gigantic superhero movie or something. I mean, anything that's really being produced by a studio, even an independent studio, is going to have a decent amount of like digital effects inside of it. Like that's every single production. It's become such a kind of dominant part of the industry that you're kind of watching it all the time. And generally a lot of great effects work is works that you wouldn't notice. So some of it's quite flashy, you know, if you're doing something that's fantastical or like superhero stuff like that. I mean, it's kind of obvious sometimes what's going on, but even, you know, especially like if you're thinking of like a period piece or something like that, where it's just replacing a lot of things that didn't exist at that time or need to be inserted that don't exist anymore, and just kind of doing swaps like that, that looks very naturalistic, but yeah, that's kind of a variety of stuff. One maybe a good example of kind of talking about the difficulty of doing something that maybe seem, you know, I'm not exactly sure, is this complicated or is it not, is a couple of times I've had people want to do crowd kind of duplication, or kind of in the idea of, there's probably a term, again, I'm not in the industry, so I just kind of often come up with my own terms, but where you would take a crowd of say 100 people and then you would film them and then move them around to different locations to make it look like a crowd of 1,000 or 2,000 or something like that. But the logistics of just getting that many extras on set is just, you know, it's too much. But you can film people, rearrange them, and just kind of move them into different parts of the shot. And what you have to do if you just shoot that as is you have to end up kind of where the seams are, where you're kind of overlapping the groups that were filmed. You have to kind of cut them out in a process called rotoscoping, where you're kind of cutting out the edges of them so they can sort of overlap, so to speak, that you can kind of not see the background in this one. And that's generally, it's not the most complicated process, but it's a very lengthy process. It's kind of a slower process. It's a very old process. It's like from the dawn of cinema that's been utilized. Obviously, there's tools now that make that a lot more efficient. But another way of doing it is you can shoot behind the crowds. You can have like large green screens that you can move around with them, in which case you're mostly just keying out or kind of removing the green of the background and just doing a little bit of cleanup. So for one example, somebody asked me to do that, and it took me probably close to like 4 or 5 days to do the rotoscoping. And then they gave me an almost identical shot, except they had green screens on set. And that maybe took me like a day to do that. Okay. So, you know, kind of incurred more cost on them on the set to do the green screen, but it cost a lot less and took less time in post-production to do it with just rotoscoping. So, I had a conversation with the producer of like, okay, well, these are your two options. You know, you can do it either way, but here's sort of the difference between the two.
Interesting. So, So I've watched your reel, which is very cool. And I see smoke and like fire and things like that. How difficult is it to include those things?
That can be a little tricky. That doing that kind of smoke, or what's often referred to as like smoke or pyro simulation or flame simulation, is that can get a little more technical in kind of like the computer realm of creating stuff like that. Normally what that involves is getting a kind of a 3D track of the space, which is just the way the computer analyzes footage and kind of can determine the objects and the depth and basically just the physical 3-dimensional space. And it can actually just sort of extrapolate that information from the footage itself. That's a gross simplification of it, but that's essentially like what it's doing. And then once you have that, you can kind of insert these kind of little systems, I guess you could say, these little particle systems inside of the computer that match up to where they would be inside of the shot. And then you're running these really complex simulations that we're not, you know, these are things that, you know, geniuses at fancy colleges figure this stuff out, but they have these, like, they're basically just these simulations which the computer simulates smoke or fire, different fluids, how they react based on how hot they are, et cetera. And you just run those and then see what they look like, and then you make adjustments and run them again. So it's a little bit of like kind of trial and error, a little bit of setup. But then once you set it up, you render it out of the computer, then you composite them into what is ultimately like a 2-dimensional kind of element at the end.
How interesting. You know, I've never really thought much about special effects before, and it never really occurred to me that it would be something that could be done on a low budget project. I just assumed that you had to have millions in a studio to do that. But
it doesn't hurt, but it is possible. I mean, you have to know how to do it. I mean,
it never hurts.
Yeah,
right?
Of course. Yeah, it's just that kind of skill. I mean, that is like fairly technical. I mean, that is not something I would like, hey, I want to learn how to do fire simulation, but I've never done visual effects before. You know, that's taking a very big leap in the beginning. So that's why generally that kind of area of visual effects often is handled by like specialists who really kind of focus on that a lot. But sometimes with projects though, you just spend enough time, a project's big enough, you're just spending enough time on it, you kind of become a temporary specialist because you just like deep dive into it so hard that you can kind of figure that stuff out. Some of that stuff I'll kind of forget after a while, and I'll have to remind myself how to do it if I have another project that comes along.
How interesting. And, you know, it seems like so much of filmmaking really is figuring it out, jerry-rigging things, holding things in one particular way, or that's one thing that surprised me getting into this industry is just how, I don't want to say cobbled together, but just how creative the problem solving has to be sometimes to make something work. And when you nail it, it's really, really cool. But the viewer would have no idea. It's so much more creative of a process than I originally realized. So tell me about the scene in Kara's film then. We used a green screen and we had me doing ab exercises, basically, just like in one of those like V-sit sort of positions, like doing our best to make me look like I was falling. How would you deal with that?
Yeah, so Kara was the director of that Tri-C student film. She was wanting a shot where there was kind of a tall shot in like a factory, right? And then we just wanted a person falling, and then so there was footage of you kind of on the green screen, just sort of sitting there simulating falling. And then they had footage of the space where you would have fallen down. So in a shot like that, you have to kind of animate, you have to key out the person. So you just have just the person falling without the green screen. So that's kind of one step of it. And then you have to animate them falling because in the footage, they're not falling. They're just kind of right in the middle of the screen. So you have to kind of shrink them down and place them up where they need to go. And then you need to animate them in a naturalistic way, which normally is kind of, adhering to the laws of physics and gravity and things like that. So you animate them down. You may have to rotoscope if there's things kind of like a pole or something that's in the foreground, you'd have to cut that out. If there's shadows and things like that, you may have to adjust the lighting on the person as they're falling if the lighting is changing as they're coming down.
Interesting. I mean, it makes sense. One question that we had when we were trying to figure it out was, well, if I'm falling and my ponytail is down, what do we do? And we tried to like blow it up and it was very, very down. So what do you do with that? Like,
in something like that, when somebody's falling, I mean, it's so fast. It's funny, like in visual effects, if it's something that's a slow shot, it may be kind of easier to set up in a sense, but the audience can really scrutinize it because they're getting a really good look at it. Something like where somebody's falling down in a shot that's maybe 1 or 2 seconds, it's so quick, I don't want to say you can do bad work, but it's just kind of, I think, having a good sense of what people recognize and what they don't recognize inside of the shot. So something like a ponytail flipping up, if it was obvious their ponytail was down, that might just even, semi-consciously trigger in someone that just looked weird, even if they don't explicitly recognize that one little element. But you can, in visual effects, I mean, you could just cut off the ponytail, so to speak, and just turn it up right side up or upside down. And I think just that enough, even without doing anything even particularly fancy, just moving it up would be enough that people wouldn't notice it. Especially, the smaller something is in the shot, the more you can kind of get away with it. And that's generally, I think, in doing a visual effects, because you can work on any shot really forever. So you kind of just have to know, like, how far do you need to take it before you just feel like 99% of people won't notice this unless they're like staring at it and you tell them. And it's funny, even when I'll complete a shot sometime, having been the person that made it, I can tell where the edges are, what's fake, what's real. And then I'll tell people, be like, does this look real to you? And they'll say, like, what are you talking about? What's fake, what's real? I can't even tell, it's so seamless at that point, but you kind of have to, that's a skill in and of itself, is knowing kind of when to call it quit and just move on to the next shot.
Wow. So when you're watching things, just in general, I mean, I suppose the ones on TV and like all the big productions are fairly seamless, I would imagine. But do you ever notice things where you're like, ooh, saw that edge, or ooh, I saw a glimpse of something that was like I don't know, something that wasn't quite tidy, or not so much?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I try not to. I actually, I'm not the type of person where I'm looking to scrutinize films. I think I'm more like of the attitude of like, just be gracious to the filmmakers, just enjoy the movie. And, if you want to scrutinize movies, you should be a professional and get paid for it, be an editor or something. Like, just enjoy the movie. That's, that's kind of the joy that you have in that position. So, but sometimes it's, especially maybe some older productions, sometimes in TV, because it's such a quick turnaround, especially older TV, sometimes they can't, they just don't have quite as much time to look at it. So sometimes you can spot stuff there a little more easily. And there are sometimes, I think, just maybe if it's a point in the movie where I'm not quite as engaged with the story, or it's just a slower moment, there might be something they're doing that I would just, for a split second, think like, oh, I wonder if they're doing this or that to pull it off. And then I can kind of start to see like, oh, I can figure they were probably, they probably rotoscope that out and cut this in. And this person's flying, but they're hanging kind of weird. I can tell they probably have a harness because their posture's a little funky.
Okay.
They're probably on a wire, even though you can't see it. And,
Right. Interesting.
I try not to think of it, but sometimes you catch it. But I just kind of move on. I don't really get hung up about it.
So. Gotta just enjoy it. Yeah. And appreciate how far we've come, right?
Right.
Going back to, you mentioned period pieces before. What are some elements of period pieces that are typical that you could change or do? Like a street of cars parked on the edge of the road. Like, are you able to turn those vehicles into vehicles from 80 years ago? Like, is that like, how does, or like, do they, I don't know. I don't understand how any of it works. I've seen footage where it's like, you see the shot and then you see what they do to it, but I don't really know. In terms of being a filmmaker, how should we go about planning our shots so that special effects can be used?
I think maybe it's a kind of a nice and clean way of looking at it is it's everything you want to do that doesn't just physically exist in the space as is, kind of as is. So, things, maybe you could physically change it. Maybe you have to do digitals. It's kind of on this scale of, what is sort of the most complicated or time-consuming thing to do, and in sort of the physical world versus the digital world. And so, for instance, like cars, you could think, well, we can just move these cars off the street. Like, they're meant to move. That's not that difficult. If a building is in there, maybe it's like a really old street where all the buildings are from 1700s. That'd probably be in Europe, probably not in America, but let's say there's one really modern building, it may be really difficult to cover that up. Obviously, can't move the building. So maybe that might be an instance where it's something that we want to do something digital versus something we could like physically kind of move out of the way and change that. So normally it's just kind of figuring out what's, from a practical standpoint, it's just sort of like what's going to take the least amount of time, what kind of helps the rest of production, what's the most budget-friendly way to achieve this. Do we want to alter the shot even slightly if that would make a really huge difference as far as like cost or production needs and things like that. And it's really kind of a case-by-case basis. You just kind of run through and sort of dissect each shot individually, each set, and then go through and kind of figure out what you want to change. In general, I would say the closer you are to the actors and kind of the main focus of the action, the more you want it to physically exist. The farther you get away, generally the more you're going to tend to do things that are digital, like a matte painting or something. And you even see that with much, much older films where they would build a set that would only go up maybe 15 feet. even though it was meant to be like 100-foot tall building or something with a bunch of crowds. So they just film that one part and then they just do a matte painting for all the background to kind of fill out the rest of it.
What is the definition of a matte painting?
So matte painting kind of comes from a term when they would build like physical mats. Matte as in matting something out. They would do things like, sometimes they actually used to just bring a sheet of glass in front of the camera and would actually do a painting on set, paint it, and then film it just to kind of line them up perfectly so they would match up. Or they would sometimes paint out black out of an area, because when you're exposing film, if you're filming something that's black, it's not exposed, and you could expose it later and then do kind of like a double expose, or kind of expose both of those elements onto there. Digitally, that term is, it's not quite as kind of accurate to the process as it once was, but it's still the term that's used. So essentially it's just creating a kind of an background scene, not necessarily background, but generally background elements that kind of like fill in part of the set or scene exist otherwise, or that you're trying to cover up, to kind of like fill out a scene. Normally just because it's something that's either just so big or just so complex or something, it just makes sense to do it as a matte painting.
Interesting. That's super interesting. What are some of your favorite examples of any films or TVs, any projects, either that you've done or ones that you think that others ought to look up and watch, that are just really good examples of cool special effects, maybe something unique that isn't typically done?
I think as when I started my career, I did not do filmmaking right away. I was a bit kind of nebulous in my direction. I was kind of all over the place trying to figure out exactly what I do when I was done with school. And I ended up landing doing a music video for a band called Isley, which had just signed with Warner Brothers. I just literally went to one of their concerts and met their dad, they're all related. So I met their dad, who was their manager.
Oh, wow.
Who was himself a designer. It was like a wonderful person. So we just got chummy really quick, and he agreed to let me do a video for them, which happened, I think, exactly 1 year later, which is not at all how that process normally goes. It was very unusual. That's how it happened. But I was kind of a wonderful, kind of weird experience to kind of go in that way. But what's been great about that was that it allowed me to do like music videos for a while, and I still will do them from time to time. And I find that music videos are great because I think, maybe even especially in America, that it's probably one of the more kind of avant-garde or experimental cinematic art forms that the general public is pretty accepting of. I think your average person on the street would maybe have a hard time seeing like a 90-minute like serious like art house film that didn't have like a normal narrative or anything, and they just walk around and just be like, oh, that's weird. But for 3 minutes, a music video, you can kind of get away with whatever you want. So that one had a lot of like, we filmed on a white set that I just covered with like butcher paper. It was like a gymnasium, and I ended up animating all these trees and flowers and birds and stuff that just grew out of this kind of white kind of infinite background. I did another one where they had these kind of steampunk robots we filmed down in Texas, and I covered up it was like an old deserted train yard, and we covered up some buildings with just pistons and stuff, and I put all these robots and these big old mechanical things. And then I also had these like helmets that were all entirely digital that had like a TV screen of their face on the front of it.
Oh, weird.
Yeah, weird, exactly. But that's what's kind of great about music videos, is I feel like you can just get away with so much and just be super creative, and you don't really need this larger sort of narrative justification. You can just kind of make it these really self-contained projects where you can just kind of get really creative and really experimental. And so I think those tend to be some of my kind of favorite examples of doing that for myself. But really, kind of going back to earlier, visual effects, I mean, filmmaking in general, like you're talking about like cobbling things together and just having to really sort of like, we just got to get this shot done. We just got to figure out. I think with visual effects, I find most situations, it does feel a little experimental, and you are kind of having to adjust the process, or even in some ways, like inventing a process for each specific shot that you're working on. So Yeah, I find in general, that's one of the things that I find exciting about visual effects is that you are kind of having to really create something a little bit from scratch, even if it's borrowing from techniques that you've known before. So I think that's always fun. I think with films that exist, I tend to, I think I like kind of a weird sort of range of stuff. I love films like Blade Runner. I think it's just still so phenomenal that a film that was made, it came out in 1982, that it was, that those effects like hold up so well. I think that just speaks to like the craftsmanship of the people who were working on the film at the time. And also their just ability to tell like what works and didn't work, not what looked good for the time, but like, does this look good, period? Does this look good forever? And I just think they're, the way they kind of crafted that film was just, it's just really beautiful and dark. And it's so heavily kind of identified as what it is. I mean, it was so influential. Yeah, it was really impressive. And then other films, 82 is actually a great year. I think there's so much great sci-fi came out there. Tron came out that year, which was a film that, was kind of one of the first big uses of digitally created imagery. Of course, it was meant to look digital because, they're like stuck in a video game, but the way they made that film was so unique. I mean, really no film was sort of made before, no film will ever be made like that again. It was just such a like inventive process. It's really wild that film got made. It was kind of it wasn't like known big film, like feature filmmakers. It was more like studio commercial artists from Canada or something that ended up making that film. But yeah, I generally like films that do stuff that's a little more experimental or just doing something kind of creative and kind of new with the medium. I mean, I like a huge, like, again, like, I don't know, some superhero film or something it's always really fun to watch, but sometimes it can just be a little tired sometimes if you see, 10 films in a row that are kind of utilizing the same sort of techniques. It's always impressive. I'm always, appreciate the work that goes into it, but it's always fun to see when anytime somebody does something, it's a little more, kind of unique or inventive or just a little bit more experimental with it.
That's awesome. That's really awesome. I have not seen Tron, but I definitely will now. And you mentioned Blade Runner. I was just in New York last weekend, and I was at the Museum of the Moving Image, and it has all these old cameras and, a lot of really interesting history about the industry. And I took pictures of it, and I'll probably end up putting them up right now so that people can see it. But I took pictures of a building, and I don't know which. I'm assuming it's the earlier Blade Runner, but I actually haven't seen that either yet. So, but there's like a building, and it's like maybe 4 feet tall. It's like a model of a building, and there's just like lights and wires and all kinds of things behind it, and it's at an angle, and it's just got all these windows, but it's maybe 4 feet by 3 feet, maybe. And I guess what they did is they like pan the camera up, and it makes it look like they're going up this building. And I was so astounded that you could have this little piece of whatever that material was that they made it with, and that could, I don't want to say accurately, but convincingly make people think that you're actually scaling a building. So
yeah. And that's I've not really gone into like model making in a physical sense. I mean, I do a ton of it in the digital sense, but in the digital sense, it's a different kind of sort of like cheating reality to kind of make it work. A lot of the principles, I guess, are the same, but yeah, it's always great to see kind of that process of it, because you're a little bit more limited in a sense with kind of like physically what you can do kind of at that scale. So yeah, it is always impressive to see like when they really kind of know what they can get away with to make it look really convincing. And, do we need to like slow down the footage and shoot at a higher frame rate to slow it down to make it seem more lumbering and slow? And, is this convincing at this size? Maybe we have to double the size of this model for it to really look big enough that it will have like the detail that we need. And yeah, I do think it's always funny in older films when they're trying to have like a model of a ship in a sea storm, and they don't build the model big enough. And even though they slow down the footage, you can really tell like that water that's not what a wave looks like when a ship is, 200 feet long. It's sometimes that's a little hard to have your suspension of disbelief in full gear.
Right. And well, and speaking of models, I guess the first time I ever saw something that was a model was at the Warner Brothers studios in London, where you have an entire room for the Hogwarts castle for the Harry Potter. It's just a magical creation, walking around the castle and seeing it. It's so little. I mean, everything looks so little, right? But it looks like so huge. And then I just, I haven't since seeing that in person, I don't think I have gone back and watched the films. I always preferred the books anyway. But I would like to actually revisit the like Hogwarts scenery from way up in the air, and just to see like, okay, so that is the model that I saw, and look at what's around it and how they create. I would love to know how they created all the green around it, the whatever's there. I mean, something digital, right?
Yeah. I mean, and again, it's often just kind of like a combination of all kinds of techniques. And I think sometimes it's become a little bit popular, maybe like when the Star Wars episodes, 7, 8, 9 that came out. There's a lot of talk about like digital versus practical effects, and like, oh, we're going back to practical effects, and which to me, I think that's kind of a funny conversation, because like I was saying earlier, like all films of that scale use tons of practical effects and tons of digital effects. Like there is no either or. It's always like, I think just a matter of like, do the filmmakers on that production, are they able to like take the time and really know kind of what's the correct balance of these things, and what's like the right techniques and tools to use to get kind of like the best effect in the end. So yeah, it's that is fun. I remember I actually did not really get into Harry Potter until I went to Universal Studios and visited the parks, and I was so impressed by the production of those like areas of the park, because they were like honestly probably better quality than most. I've been on a few like big Hollywood film sets. I mean, it just was like so impressive, and I think I was so smitten by it, I ended up kind of then watching the movies and then reading the books. I totally went in reverse of I think most funny. People.
That is funny. Yeah, it's amazing. And I'm definitely, after our conversation, I'm definitely going to be more cognizant of what we see, what I'm consuming. I've been watching Breaking Bad recently, and some of those explosions, some of those fires, some of the the things like the green smoke coming, or steam, whatever that is, coming out of the top of the camper van, or the RV, whatever. I look at that and I think, okay, that's probably a special effect of some variety. You're right, it's everywhere. And I'm just, the more we learn, the more interesting the whole thing gets. So one thing that you didn't mention earlier that I would love for you to talk about is your theater.
Yeah, so I have worked. Well, I'm one of the co-founders of the Nightlight Cinema, which is it's an art house, independent, nonprofit cinema in Akron. So we're currently the only art house cinema in Akron, which was great that we were able to do that. And we've been open since, I believe, 2014. I'm really bad with dates. I think that's when we opened. So we're creeping up on 8 years now. And it's a single screen theater. We're looking to actually expand out shortly, but it's just a place where we just wanted to be able to have art house cinema in Akron, and we wanted to make a really great space. I studied in school. I studied design, actually not film, so I actually studied a lot of interior space design. That wasn't my primary focus, but I did study a lot of that. So I was like immediately very concerned when we opened, like, oh, we just want this to be like a great physical space that people would just want to be in anyway.
And it is. It's beautiful. You walk inside and there's that little couch on the right and all the tables, just the hallway. It's so classy. I love that space. So you guys did a really good job. I haven't gotten to see a film there yet. That was just our base camp for when we were filming Air. But I can't wait to go back. It's gorgeous. So
yeah, it's been a wonderful experience. I mean, I think our goal was to really make a place that felt beautiful and wonderful, that made it seem like film was a special thing, and that we really like cared about the people that came in there. Really wanted to make it seem like a nice night out, to, you know, to kind of just make the community and the kind of the art form of cinema special. But we didn't also want it to seem too highbrow or alienating. We really wanted it to seem very comforting at the same time. And that's a little bit of a tricky balance, I think, to achieve that. But I think so far we've done a pretty good job of that. And the community loves it. I mean, the community is really supportive, and yeah, we're just, we're excited to just kind of exist. And yeah, it's been a fun thing to be involved with.
So how do you get films as a movie theater? How do you get those films to come? Like, how do you, like, what's the process of bringing films to your theater?
It's a little less kind of structured, I guess, or guaranteed. There's often some like negotiation and some like last minute decision making that goes in on that process, both on our end and the distributor's end. More so than I think, enough that would probably surprise, I think, kind of the average person. So typically films are starting to get released by distributors, and they're always kind of feeling out, you know, how big of a release do we want to do? How big is this film? Do we think it's going to be? You know, because not all films get the same distribution. You know, some are in thousands of movie theaters, some are in 10 movie theaters to begin with. Some have really long, kind of real slow releases, some are really quick. So it really just depends. And you just kind of have to negotiate with them. And then there's like a fairly standard fee that comes with films. It's a little bit different for each movie. I wouldn't say it's drastically different. And then there's other things where sometimes it's a flat fee, sometimes it's a percentage of ticket sales. Sometimes they want guarantees that you're going to show up for at least this long, you know, depending on, you know, the movie. So there's definitely some negotiation that kind of is involved with that. So normally it's like maybe like a month out, you're kind of picking your schedule. But sometimes there can be some pretty late, almost like last minute decisions that have to be made with that.
How interesting. Well, I will definitely make sure I'm on whatever mailing list or just social media, whatever it is, to learn about what you guys are up to and to keep up to date, because I can't wait to go back and actually see a film. It really is a classy place, but it is comfortable. It definitely walks that line well that you mentioned. So I feel like you could get dressed up or not and be happy there.
Oh, that's great to hear. That was exactly what we were aiming for. Like, if you wanted to dress up, you would feel totally comfortable doing that. And if you didn't, you wouldn't feel bad about
you
not
wouldn't
dressing.
feel like a slob.
Right.
Interesting. Well, yeah, definitely keep us up to date, because it's kind of a rare community hub. I think you don't get too many community centers, at least in the realm of where I tend to go and spend my time. It's like, I wish we had more places like that, more independent, interesting community spaces. So if anybody's interested in opening a community space, the Nightlight is one to check out.
Oh, well, thank you.
So
yeah.
I wanted to ask you about your writing. In a previous conversation, you told me that you've been doing a lot more writing lately. Tell me about that.
I think that came out of, I didn't necessarily write a lot. I think, you know, growing up in school, I think in English classes, I always either got A's or C's. I think I was sort of like someone who wanted to do good and occasionally would, but occasionally like wouldn't. And then when I became more into filmmaking, I ended up writing a number of scripts for, you know, various reasons. I actually was kind of lucky enough to do an internship with James V. Hart's production company. And he was like a, you know, very kind of successful screenwriter in Hollywood, and did some work there. I thought I was very unqualified to do it, but they were gracious to let me intern there and kind of work with them. And I always really liked writing screenplays, but I think I was always a little bit antsy in creating them and really wanting to get to the production process of it. And I had this idea for a film that it just was like a couple of scenes. It wasn't like a fully fleshed story, but I had it in my head for, I don't know, like 5-10 years or something. And I just kept thinking about it. And I think I got tired of thinking about it. And I realized it was too big of a production. Like, I was never going to independently create it. And I would think maybe didn't have the energy to feel like I'm going to write a script and send it off to studio and try to get it made. So I just kind of had the idea at that point in time of like, oh, maybe I could write a book. So I sort of slowly decided like, oh, that might be nice, because then it'll just be its own thing, like it'll be its own work, and that'd be kind of nice. And just to be able to tell the story, which, I think that was part of my love of filmmaking, is just being a storyteller. So the more I got into writing, the more I worked on it, the more I kind of researched it, the more I fell in love with it. So it came to a point where I ended up, I've been working on this fiction series called Valley of Progress. It's this fictional world. It's something kind of comparable to maybe like 1900, like late Industrial Revolution era of society. And it's kind of an adventure story about discovering these and this inventor takes this group of pilgrims up into this undiscovered mountain range because they want to, form this idealized society and this progressive technological society. And it kind of follows the society once they get up inside of there. But once I got into it, started writing, a friend of mine, Rob Lucas, was a friend who helped with the Nightlight. He was really kind of the person who sort of started the organizations that ended up leading into the Nightlight. He worked for a publisher for a long time, and so we got to collaborate on other things, and he was a huge help. And he helped me find my first book editor. I've recently gotten a new book editor named Lauren Folk, and she's been fantastic. And I don't know, I just love writing. So we're about to release my second novel, and there's 2 novellas inside of that series. So it's going to be a total of like 6 books, 3 novels, 3 novellas in total. But
well,
it's a blast. I love it. Yeah.
Congratulations. That's wonderful.
Oh, thank you. Yeah. I'm kind of shocked. There was a period of time, I think after college, I was so, I don't know, exhausted from reading just a million books in college. I wasn't reading anything. I don't think I read a book for maybe like a 5-year period or something. And so I was kind of surprised when I got into writing, but I just totally fell in love with it again. And yeah.
I think that's common. I think we read so many academic texts that the desire, at least people who like to read, the time you have to read outside of school is almost nil, or at least it feels that way. I mean, I'll speak for my own time management, I guess. And then you get away from it. So yeah. I think it's noble to go back to, and I'm working on it myself. But I'm curious because I'm just starting to get into screenwriting. I just read Blake Snyder's Save the Cat and have been watching things through new eyes now. Like, oh, there's a scene. Oh, there's a Save the Cat scene. Oh, there's that. Just like being able to identify the structure and appreciate it and appreciate the story more of whatever I'm watching because of that awareness. Do you have any comparisons that you've made, any similarities or maybe dissimilarities between screenwriting and writing novels you can point out?
I would say the similarity comes from, I think in a broader sense, just storytelling. And I come from I'm like a novelist who's coming from a film background. So I think my way of approaching, at least this particular series, is a little bit more cinematic in my approach. Just as far as kind of drawing out scenes and kind of plots and storylines and stuff. So I think in just like the way in coming up with the story is pretty similar. I'm someone, I don't know if this is because of my design background, but I really like to kind of outline things. I'm quite pragmatic in how I'm like structuring, like these are these characters' motivations and here's the story and here's what happens, and really plotting things out until I get into the actual writing itself. But once you get into the actual form of it and really kind of getting into the manuscript of it, that I think then they really kind of diverge. Because in film, you're really only writing in a screenplay what is visible on screen. So you're not writing inner dialogue. You're really just kind of writing what lands in the frame. Versus, and it's very, can be a little bit more mechanical. I don't find it's as pleasant writing a screenplay. I think just because the art form, there's no prose, it's not like the poetry of like writing literature. So, but I think it's fun in that you're kind of getting to the next steps. You're kind of imagining that kind of element of it in the whole grander scheme of creating a film. And again, I think just because I've always been involved with the full production and largely post-production, I think I just get kind of anxious to like get into like the next phase of it a little bit. Versus writing and literature, I think it's just, it's just kind of its own form. So you can, the language itself and, how you're kind of using words, it's sort of, it's not kind of a means to an end. It's just kind of its own thing. So it was probably a problem. I was probably overwriting way too much when I first started writing. I was, I think I kicked it into like 10th gear of my prose and poetry vehicle, and I got a little crazy. So, which was great that someone suggested I hire an editor, and I did, and I think that ended up being like a huge help. But yeah, I think it's, story's same, but then like once you kind of get into like the mechanics and the art form of it, they really kind of diverge quite a bit after that.
Excellent. Well, I can't wait to read them, and you'll have to let us know when your new ones are coming out.
Yeah, very soon. I'm doing kind of a minor re-edit of some of my, since I've switched editors, of my first 3 books. But the next novel is, it's essentially done. So it should be coming out quite soon. And yeah, I'm excited to get it out. So I have a website, valleyofprogress.com. You can always kind of see. And of course, being an artist, visual artist, there's like tons of maps and drawings and ads, and I invented things, and there's blueprints, and yeah, if you're into all that world building stuff, there's a gob of it in there. So
oh yeah, absolutely. Would you ever do not necessarily a graphic novel per se, but something that includes maybe a hybrid, prose and picture book that included those elements? My students love stuff like that. They tend to like graphic novels to begin with because pictures, but those hybrid ones, they get so excited. They don't even want to read the text. They just want to look at the cool stuff, but it really aids their understanding and helps them get into it, and particularly for readers who are dyslexic, and have greater challenge comprehending what's going on to begin with, or remember it, having the connection from like this paragraph to this paragraph, like having that visual element might help. Anyways, I go off on a tangent a bit, but would you ever consider making a more visually minded version of your books?
Yeah, for sure. Even in my novels, they're not graphic novels, they're not picture books, but there are, I would say every like 30 pages or so, I have an illustration in the novels themselves. So, and there's like maps and stuff. So I really like visualizing, all of that stuff. I think if I just, if I didn't need to sleep or something, I probably would have an image every 5 pages or something just to kind of flesh it out even more. So that's been fun. It'd be a little bit different. It's interesting with the books. I've not done any illustrations of like characters, because I think I've appreciated the reader's kind of ability to sort of fill in some of that on their own. I think it's kind of fun as a reader in a novel to kind of develop some things, but some things like advertisements for there's like an ice cream parlor that's quite prevalent in the first novel. So I did like an ad for that. And just different, elements, or like stores or a product or like a gadget or something. There's a lot of gadgets in the book that, come up. I'll sort of draw something out just to help kind of, be these sort of like ambient kind of set pieces to help build up, to help kind of like visualize like the grander world as it is. Yeah.
How wonderful. Well, I can't wait to read them. Are there any other elements that you want to tell me about in terms of your career, or do you have any advice for people looking into getting into writing, or starting a community venture, or doing visual effects, or looking to use visual effects?
Well, the last big thing that I've really gotten into is game development. It's something I've always really wanted to get into. I've always kind of looked at, video games a little bit more as like a storytelling medium. I've played them ever since I was a kid, but, you can do so much with it. You could essentially have like a film, or they have a lot of video games that are essentially like kind of visual novels. And it's just like I just think there's a lot of opportunities with like experimentation in the medium. was never a programmer though. I never learned that. So that was always a pretty big hurdle. If you're doing interactive media, kind of have to know how to program stuff or find people that do. But I think that was a thing during COVID that I just was able to really kind of spend a lot of time in it. So I started like early 2020 working on a project. And it's gotten to a point now that I'm going to like start really pushing into that more and more. I actually made like a whole completed game for a little game jam, which is kind of like, if you're familiar with like a 48-hour film contest, it's kind of that same sort of idea.
What is the I'm familiar with certain film contests, like 48-hour film contest. What is the $40 film contest?
I'm sorry, it is 48-hour.
Oh, I thought you said $40. Wait, maybe you did say that and I misheard you. I was like, whoa, what's that? That sounds shoestring.
I think a lot of $40 film challenges probably are $40 film challenges as well.
Fair enough.
Yeah,
fair enough.
But it's just making a video game, in a very like short span of time. And this one was, I think, was 2 weeks. But yeah, I just like, it's just essentially, it's just, I find coding and just like creating structures and interactive elements. Once I kind of got over that, what I considered a very steep kind of like programming hump, I'm now at a place where I feel a lot more comfortable with it. And it's just doing, making a video game and can be just like writing stuff, creating like worlds. It's a lot of like level design, but then just doing tons of artwork. So I have done kind of not as much illustration kind of later in my career. So it's been kind of a nice medium to get into, to be able to doing a lot of illustration work as well. So we'll see. I think when I have less energy to run around on film sets and stuff like that, I might be like an old man making video games in my office. So.
Well, you're still young, so if you wait until then, it might be a long time from now. But I guess one last question. You describe yourself as someone who has done many, many different things in, over the span of your career. Do you have any advice for any creators, any creatives who have varied interests, who might be interested in trying out many different things, or who maybe aren't quite sure how they want to break into the industry? They just know they want to be a part of this massive machine.
Yeah. When I grew up, I guess I've always considered myself a very well-rounded person. I never thought I was exceptional at any one particular thing. And I bring that up just to say that I just had a lot of interests, but I think when you're trying to figure out, what's going to be the thing that you do when you're older, sometimes that makes it a difficult conversation, even with like adults, like, what are you going to do? And, and I've just slowly kind of over time more and more accepted that it doesn't necessarily have to be any one thing or any 5 or 10 things. And that a person's capacity to learn is really, it's kind of unlimited. I think that's one thing I really like to press upon my students when I'm teaching them, when they just, kind of say things like we all say, like, well, I can't draw, or I can't do this. And I'm like, well, it's not that you can't do it. It's that you have not found it to be easy up to this point, perhaps, but you just got to spend, you spend time doing it, you'll get better at it. That's just kind of inevitable. So I think if people are interested in learning any one particular thing, I think studying kind of examples of what you really like and what's been made, just to kind of investigate, who made that. If you can find anything like interviews or featurettes or anything about how the interviews of the people, of how they came about making it, and then kind of experimenting and trying to make versions on your own, which probably initially will be, pale comparisons to what, the actual thing is, but you try it again and see, do you like it? Is it something that you're interested in, and just keep going on. It's, I find I've just really like learning things, which is, it's something that seems like an evil statement when you're a child, like learning, but it's funny when, when you're not in school and you don't like have to learn, so to speak, but you have the option to kind of learn whatever you want at that point and then kind of apply it. I think it's been useful, but I guess really you just have to kind of accept that you can learn it, which everyone can, of course. And then just to like take yourself serious enough that you can like really kind of learn it and pursue it. And there's so many like online learning tools now that I think there's so much information to do that. But I think also to do that, and then I think to try to find somebody that does in some capacity like something you're interested in, at the very least just have like conversations with them to see, you know, what sort of their take on it, what do they really do, and to kind of like dip your toe into that world. And you know, it was interesting when I did my internship in Hollywood when I was probably like, I don't know, 20 years old. It was such a fascinating thing, aside from just being this wide-eyed kid in Hollywood. And, you know, I'm like, oh my gosh, I saw Tom Hanks and I saw Ken Roston, this guy worked in Star Wars. And I just was kind of like blowing my mind. And, but I also, you know, on top of being inspired by getting to see these huge scale kind of productions underway, that I also realized that, you know, these are human beings. Like, these are not these people who are kind of beyond, you know, kind of what common man can do. I mean, I think these are people that probably worked hard and believed in themselves and had a lot of, you know, maybe some of them had some like great opportunities, but, you know, it's like, oh yeah, like you can, this is achievable, you can do it. And, you know, breaking into the industry, sometimes that can be sort of its own kind of complex thing. And I would almost consider myself not really even in the industry, because I've generally worked as like an independent artist in many ways. But yeah, I think you just like keep pursuing it. And like, yeah, I think I know that sounds like such a simple answer. I don't think there's any like kind of like mysterious to it. It's just work hard and, you know, eventually you'll learn.
I agree. I think that one key that you mentioned was finding people who are doing it and asking them questions. Would you be open to people reaching out to you if they're interested in any of the things that you've discussed with us today?
Yeah, I really love, I think that's one thing I really maybe drew me kind of back or convinced me to stay maybe in the Midwest is, you know, the scene can be a little, or really honestly quite competitive, you know, if you're going to like Los Angeles or New York. And I have found here it's like a little not as competitive, but I think that's actually a positive thing. I think I like kind of collaborating with people. You know, I'm a big believer in like mutual success. Yeah. You know, like if people want to get better, I don't, you know, I think I'm just like happy to contribute or help out in any way that I can. And yeah, because I wish, you know, when I was younger, I kind of wish that I had, you know, kind of knew who these people were. And there certainly were people, I just didn't know kind of where to reach them. And, you know, I don't know, I just was maybe a little nervous or scared or something, and to kind of like just kind of put myself out there. But
well, and yeah, you know, people make themselves so much more available now, or rather some of them do. Others you might have to dig, but having that persistence to just reach out and ask, it's like you say, like they are real people. Yeah.
And I would say maybe a piece of advice I could give is that if you're looking for people to kind of collaborate or maybe mentor you, or even just to kind of, you know, give you some advice or something, that I find you can tell generally pretty quickly if they want to do that or if they don't. And if they don't, you really don't need to waste your time trying to convince someone to help you if they don't want to help you. Because there'll be plenty of people who do, and plenty of people out there that, you know, who will just appreciate the value of getting to like kind of just share experiences and information with people, and who would be, you know, just happy to be able to just collaborate with someone and to kind of help them out and give them a hand.
I agree. Well, Cory, thank you so much for talking to me. We talked about so many different things, which I think is actually pretty great because it's representative of your career, right? It's this and this and this and this. And that's how my life sort of has been as well. It's been like a little bit of this, little bit of this, little bit of this, little bit of that. And, you know, you gave us a lot to talk about, a lot to think about. So thank you so much for your willingness to share with the community. And I will definitely be in touch. And I look forward to seeing you next time I see you, probably on set somewhere.
Yeah, probably. Yeah. Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. Bye, Cory.